Yeah. Although it's,
Today.
and we're live.
Oh, there we go.
It is Tuesday, August 11th, 2020, 5:01 p.m. Joe Biden has picked Kamala Harris as his running mate. The weather in Washington is pregnant with the thunderstorm that has not yet arrived. And Kate has a story for you all. In fact, two stories for you all, and they are wonderful. And I am going to sip this glass of Zinfandel while I listen to her tell them.
So a couple of weeks ago, I got an email in my inbox from a winery that said, "Hello, Joel Woodward, who watches your show, is a big fan of our wine and also a fan of your show, and would like to send you some wine uh, as a thank you for doing your show." To which I said, thank you. Like, that's amazing. um, and I quickly furnished my email or my address.
How many times prior to that, Kate, have you ever been contacted by a winery to say that somebody wanted to send you wine? Because
Never.
that has literally never happened to me.
Never happened to me either, but I will say that we did have that whole incident with the butter. And so there's like, sorry, but anyways, so this beautiful bottle, beautiful bottles from the Jeff Cohn Cellars. This is a Zinfandel from 2016, arrived, and Ben and I decided on the Zinfandel. Well, Ben decided on the Zinfandel, and I just followed suit today, and it's very good. And thank you so much, Joel. It was a very nice gift.
We are. This is Joel Woodward is a model to you all. And by the way, even followed. We've had some incidents at Brookings. One day, in perhaps the weirdest day I've spent at Brookings, a giant chocolate pentagon showed up. No card, no return address.
Were you comfortable eating it?
I did eat a piece of the chocolate pentagon. Susan Hennessy was like, "No way am I touching that." Nobody who ate the chocolate pentagon died. We still have no idea where it came from. And shortly thereafter, other stuff started showing up. Initially scotch, and then baked goods. And we had to say, like, no, we can't do this. Because, like, some QAnon person is going to get on this bandwagon and it's going to end ugly. And so we had to, like, we started throwing stuff out, actually. But when it comes from a winery that calls you up and says, "Hey, we're coming from winery," then you know that it is not QAnon, because they actually can't impersonate a winery.
Joel, I mean, like, if no offense to Joel, but I didn't know Joel from Adam, and if Joel had called me up and asked me for my address, I would have been like,
But the winery, you can Google it, you can find out that it really exists. And so, and I've been drinking this wine now for half an hour. I'm not dead. So, Joel Woodward, thank you, sir. This is exceptional of you.
But
Kate is not done.
I'm not done. So the other thing that's happened is, you all know that there has been a search for the merch that's been going on for In Lieu of Fun, trying to figure out something. And I have been coordinating over Twitter with the legendary John Bordeaux, who asked what I would think about various types of kind of logos, and had an artist in mind. And so he got this artist and asked me what I thought should be in it. He gave me a list of things. I thought all of them were excellent. So he went forward with it. And so now we have this as our possible logo, and maybe this will be the poll of the day, is whether or not this should be the Lieu of Fun logo, In Lieu of Fun logo. And I would say that this is kind of an amazing moment. We have baby.
So walk us through it, because there are so many elements of In Lieu of Fun here.
Yes. And so this is kind of incredible. So you don't know this, Josh, but we used to measure time first in Boris Johnson news, because shortly when we started this show, like it was Boris Johnson had just gone into the hospital for COVID. So it was like tracking his news about his health. And then at the same time, murder hornets showed up in the United States for the first time, and it seemed like some great it was around Passover, I think. Actually, it seemed like
a long time ago at this point.
Yes, exactly. So we have murder hornets here. Ben has an ongoing thing with he collects and fires baby cannons, which are just miniature cannons, and he fires them at miniature bottles of baby prosecco, which we call baby prosecco. One of which murdered his computer screen at one point when it ricocheted on live while we were doing the show. And then at one point I found a baby chipmunk in the course of doing the show.
Like a real baby chipmunk.
Like a real baby chipmunk, and had it on the show and was like showing it on the show. And so now we have baby chipmunk like in a swarm of bees. Oh, we also had live bees on the show because one of our guests is a beekeeper. And so we had like live bees swarming the baby cannon with baby chipmunk firing it at murder hornet, who is holding the bottle of baby prosecco. And truly it is kind of a legendary illustration.
I mean, I don't vote in the polls, but damn, I am pro this image.
Yeah, it's kind of, this is exactly what I was imagining. The only thing I want is like a Gettysburg hat for the chipmunk, but no one else is probably going to agree with me. I just really like that idea. Anyways, we don't have fun anymore.
Iconography right there. I mean,
yeah, it is. It's very dense. It's like a coat of arms. My wife is an historian,
and she spends her days unpacking images like that. So, I'm all in favor.
Josh, thank you for listening to our incredibly long introduction. We don't have fun anymore, but in lieu of fun, we have Josh Chafetz, who is a professor of law at Georgetown Law School, where I went to law school. I don't think you were teaching there when I was there, were you?
No, you were at Cornell.
First year. I just moved there this summer.
That's what I thought. Okay. Yeah, and you were.
So are you in
D.C.
now, or are you still up in Ithaca?
No, I'm in D.C. now.
Wow. Oh, awesome.
So we managed to move mid-pandemic.
You came down. You moved to D.C. in time for a D.C. summer.
Indeed. Well, we were actually living in Richmond, Virginia, which is where my wife's job is. So we actually moved north for the summer.
Yeah. Oh wait, so is your wife also an academic?
She is, yeah.
Okay, so is she a historian of like coat of arms? I want to hear about this.
She's an art historian. She works on 19th century European painting.
Oh, those truly are like this thing. They're like literally stories, like they're little like novels, like
exactly.
That's so cool. Oh, awesome.
All right, so the overwhelming vote in the poll today, if you haven't voted in the poll yet, you still have time, but so far there's an overwhelming vote in favor of the image, but with the addition of the words "in lieu of fun." So if you're opposed to the image or want the image with no explanation, you got to get in now, because we're people. So Kate, bring back the image for a moment so people who missed your fabulous monologue can see it. Specifically, Joyce Fisher. All right.
Hold on. I'm getting it.
I have an important question for you, Josh, that I think you've probably never been asked in an interview before, but we get to the important stuff on In Lieu of Fun. How often and in what contexts do you get confused with Jason Chafetz?
Pretty much every time he does something or says something especially ridiculous, my Twitter feed lights up. I've never been confused for him in real life, so that's something.
So what's the your politics aren't similar, you're in a different vocation, and yet you're kind of in the same debates a lot of the time in a weird kind of way, and the difference is a different J first name and an extra F.
Exactly.
Right? And plus, he's a loon, and you're a serious constitutional scholar. And so, how does that feel? I mean, there's no, like uh, Bob. Bob Wittes is my father, so that's a bad example. But there's no like Bill Wittes with an extra T, who's like a crazy Jim Jordan like congressman. So just like, is there trauma here?
Yeah, well, I noticed someone in the chat just mentioned Matt Gertz, and he and I sort of have this, running support group because he gets all of the Matt Gaetz sort of hate mail. I get the Jason Chafetz hate mail.
And what do you do with it? Do you like respond, no, wrong guy, or do you just ignore it, or do you like? Is there a protocol?
I have a couple different ways I handle it, depending on my mood at the time. Really, sometimes I will just completely pretend that I don't understand the mistake. So someone will just tweet at me like, you're a horrible person, I hope you die, and I'll be like, well, that seems rude. Why would you think that? Why would you wish ill on me? I just sort of get to see how many.
That seems rude.
Just like see how many tweets I can go through before someone, before they figure it out. I also have a little graphic I made that one of those like countdown calendars, and so just it's been 0 days since someone confused me with the former chair of the House Oversight Committee. So sometimes I'll just post that, just whatever takes my mood at the time.
All right, the final vote is in. Yes, but add the words in lieu of fun. Got 38 votes to 6 for yes. Only one person opposed the image. So I think we have the answer. We're using this image with the addition of the words in lieu of fun, and we will make merch with it. And the next step is figuring out what charity gets the proceeds.
Yeah.
So you've moved to Washington, north from Ithaca, New York.
Wait, hold on. Were you in Ithaca, New York, or were you in Richmond?
So, I think of you as a Cornell guy.
Yeah, so I was on the Cornell faculty for 12 years. My wife has been on the Virginia Commonwealth University faculty for 9 years now. So we sort of had Richmond as our home base, and then I would commute up to Ithaca. So our sort of center of gravity has been in Virginia for a while now.
Gotcha. So for those of you who are not from what we call here the DMV, the difference between Richmond, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. is 2 hours, maybe 2.5 hours, and a cultural chasm. Because Richmond, Virginia is really two states. There's Northern Virginia, which is, basically part of Maryland. And there's Southern Virginia, which is basically part of North Carolina. And Richmond is kind of, and there's Western Virginia, which is part of, West Virginia.
West Virginia, it's cold country.
Yeah.
I would characterize Richmond a little bit differently. I would say it's its own region. It's state capital, so it's got sort of all of that energy. But also, VCU is actually bigger than UVA, and there are parts of Richmond that really feel like a college town. And a great
and there are parts of it that feel like a company town too. The sort of Philip Morris. I think Richmond's a really neat city, but it's culturally really far from Washington.
That's right.
And so, like, how does it feel moving here? Do you feel like you're moving into the swamp, the belt, or is it like, aliyah to a higher plane?
Closer.
Have you moved from real America to the swamp?
Well, I'm that weird law professor who writes more about Congress as an institution than about the courts. So actually, living on Capitol Hill is quite wonderful for me. And just getting to be near. I mean, obviously, nothing's been open since we moved here, but be near places like Brookings, places like the R Street Institute.
Where are you? Like, what neighborhood?
Capitol Hill.
Oh, okay, got it. Cool.
So yeah, it's actually been it's been quite nice.
All right,
awesome.
So Congress. What the fuck?
Oh, where to
I
start?
mean, greatest
Yeah, where to
deliberative
start?
body in the world where they don't do any deliberation. The People's House, where, which is wholly unrepresentative of the people. And the speech and debate clause, which protects, things other than speech and debate.
Not enough things, but yeah. Or at least not as the Supreme Court has interpreted it. But
So why does it suck so much?
well, I think partly part of the answer is that it doesn't. Part of the answer is, and so there's this great book by political scientists named John Hibbing and Elizabeth Thies-Morse called Congress as Public Enemy. And basically what they find is that Americans claim that they really like democracy, but what they really don't want to do is see it in action. And so actually they argue that the parts of Congress that people like the least are in fact the most representative parts, the times when it's actually behaving in the way that in the abstract, we claim we want it to behave. So part of it, I think, is that it would be really hard to actually have a functioning legislature, a functioning and powerful legislature that people liked. That part of what it is to be a legislature is to sort of show how the sausage is made, and people are never going to like that. And then part of what's going on is just that there have been a series of changes, reforms, and cultural mores that have developed over years that are genuinely unattractive. In a better world, we wouldn't have.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit more about that. When you say social mores that in a better world we wouldn't have. I feel like the line between Senate and Congress has the House of Lords and the House of Commons, if you will, has slowly disintegrated over time. There's some level of the discourse that the discourse is a little higher in the Senate, but it's actually not particular. I just feel like this has not been the case for a long time. And mostly I kind of have been thinking about this in terms of Madisonian ideals about kind of gatekeepers on certain types of laws and certain types of acts and certain types of kind of things that you want to have happen, versus a more direct democracy. And I think about that because I'm working on all of this stuff around technology and the democratization of technology. So I'm just kind of curious, do you think that am I wrong kind of thinking about that as maybe the Senate losing its place? Has that been actually happening for a long time? Or maybe I'm wrong and you think the Senate does still have kind of some type of more elite check or kind of substantive check on Congress?
I think there is definitely a sort of important, or there's several important differences at play here. One is just that if you have 6-year terms and staggered terms, even if all the personnel are the same, they're going to behave differently, right? One reason they're going to behave differently is just because they don't have to think about elections as often. But they're also, as an aggregate whole, going to behave differently because you can have some kind of sort of intense feeling that takes hold of the public that can really capture the House of Representatives in an important way, in the way that basically the Tea Party movement did in 2010. But it can never capture the Senate in one electoral cycle, right? Because even if every single seat that was up went to that sort of faction, that would still only be a third of the Senate.
That's such a tremendous point. But sorry. That's such a, but I just want to kind of hold on that for a second. Cause that's a really great point. It does make it much more,
particularly in combination with statewide elections.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So that, not only do you have the staggered 6-year terms, but you have the impossibility of gerrymandering districts. And so, yes, there are safe Senate seats, but a safe Senate seat is less safe than a safe House seat, and there are significantly fewer of them.
Right. And sort of just maybe another way of putting that, right, is just that the bigger the constituency you have, and in all but 2 states, the senators have a bigger constituency than the House members. The bigger the constituency you have, the sort of more kinds of interests you're going to have to take into account, the more kinds of interests you're going to have to appeal to, and the harder it is to win as a sort of truly extreme candidate. So that even though you see polarization in the Senate as well as in the House, you don't see the same sort of extreme tails in the Senate that you see in the House for the most part. And I guess the other thing I would say about sort of salient differences between the two is that the Senate's rules are still structured as to be a sort of extreme minoritarian institution. Even with the sort of diminution of importance of the filibuster, it's still the case that in the Senate, one senator can gum things up a lot, and 41 senators can bring a whole lot of things to a screeching halt. Whereas in the House, the rule really is that the majority rules, and by majority I mean capital L majority. I mean the leadership of the majority party rules, and it can get things through with very little resistance as quickly as it wants to. So the fact that there's no Senate equivalent of the role of the House Rules Committee, for example, is a really major difference between the two, and something that doesn't seem likely to change, even if the legislative filibuster were to go away, for example.
So how big a deal is the debate over the filibuster? I mean, if you get rid of the filibuster tomorrow, first of all, I actually have a bunch of questions about the filibuster. The concern about this is that you recreate the House and the Senate, and you've just sort of asserted that that's not quite right. And the question is, why isn't it quite right? If you make legislation passable on a 51 vote majority, or at least votable on, if you can end debate on a 51 vote majority, why doesn't the Senate become significantly more like the House?
It becomes more like the House. It doesn't become sort of fully like the House. Partly, again, because of the sort of longer terms, the smaller number of senators. Partly because getting rid of the filibuster wouldn't actually create something like the Rules Committee. It wouldn't actually give the kind of power to the Senate Majority Leader that the House leadership has, that the Speaker and the House Majority Leader have in terms of agenda setting. Right? That would take another step beyond that, and that step would not be sort of just entailed in eliminating the filibuster. So there would still be sort of fairly significant differences in procedure between the two that are in addition to, or sort of sitting on top of, differences in culture, differences in composition between the two.
All right, second question about the filibuster. And this one's going to sound provocative, but I mean it really seriously. I don't understand why the Democrats want to do this. I look at the Senate and I say this is structurally advantaging Republicans. You have these giant empty rural states like Wyoming and Montana that get 2 senators, and Democrats are packed into relatively small numbers of cities. And I forget it's what percentage of the population is represented by 52 senators, but it's something staggeringly small. And Republicans have been in control of the Senate a much larger percentage of the time than Democrats over the last bunch of years, since 1980. So if you're Chuck Schumer and you are momentarily in charge of the Senate and you blow up the filibuster rule, aren't you in fact empowering yourself for a very short period of time and empowering the minority, which will be the majority much more often than you are, for a much greater percentage of the time? What am I missing?
Well, I think there's a couple things. One is that I think it's easy to overstate the extent to which sort of small states lean Republican. So I think of the 10 smallest states by population, I think it's 6 Republican states and 4 Democratic states. If, say, D.C. and Puerto Rico were to become states, then I think that it would be 6 Democratic states and 4 Republican states would be the smallest states. So it's not advantaging while it does give a real advantage to small states, we forget that it's not, small states aren't just, Montana and the Dakotas. It's also Delaware and Vermont.
No, but hang on a second. The number 10 is a bit arbitrary there. What if you said 20? What if you said 26?
Well, I don't have it in front of me,
but, or 25, right? Like if you said the bottom half of the bottom half of the population density, the population states are disproportionately Republican, which is why there is no chance, zero, that that the Biden might win an overwhelming majority of the electoral vote. He might win a significant percentage of the very high percentage of the popular vote, and yet a very large percentage of the states, in numerical terms, the landmass of the country, is going to vote for the president. Now, we don't vote in terms of land, we vote in terms of people, but we do set up states in terms of land, and that advantages conservatism in the Senate.
So I think there's sort of two other things that are worth mentioning here. One is that the question for the Democrats, I don't think, assuming they have 50, 51, 52 seats after this election, the question isn't going to be, well, do we get rid of the filibuster and advantage ourselves and thereby also advantage Republicans? Because what they have to think is, well, okay, if we get rid of it and Republicans retake control of the Senate, which is what you're positing will happen, and at some point it obviously would happen. If Democrats still have control of the presidency and the House at that point, then getting rid of the filibuster doesn't do anything for the Republicans, right? Getting rid of the filibuster mostly only does something for them when you have unified government. And you have to think then the next time Republicans have unified government, are they likely to get rid of the filibuster whether the Democrats do or not? Now, one response to that would be, well, they didn't 2017 to 2019. To my mind, that's just plain and simple evidence of the weakness of Trump as president and the weakness of Trump as party leader. That Trump's agenda was not McConnell's agenda, was not Paul Ryan's agenda. And so they saw no need to, except for judges where the Democrats had already done it, they didn't actually want to eliminate the filibuster because they wanted it as a useful bar to not passing things like border wall funding that Trump wanted. I think if the next time you have a Republican president who is actually a strong party leader and Republicans also have control of the House and a majority in the Senate, the filibuster would be gone anyway. So I don't think the question is, do Democrats empower Republicans by doing this? The question is just, do Democrats empower themselves for however long a period of time by doing this?
That's the best argument I've heard for it. Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that so what I want to kind of get at is how I know that we've been kind of walking around that. Well, maybe in my mind, we've been walking around the issue, maybe no one else, but I've been thinking as you guys have been talking about the Electoral College and why every time it is that there is a terrible, the idea that the filibuster has suddenly come up as a thing to change after literal centuries of this filibuster being kind of this thing. Oh, no. So Josh, correct me. Is that incorrect? Is there a story about Jimmy Stewart, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, that makes the case against the filibuster? Well,
so it depends what you mean by filibuster, right? There's no sort of clear definition of what the filibuster is. What is true is that for until the early 20th century, there had never been a way of cutting off debate in the Senate. That said, Greg Koger has a wonderful book on the filibuster, which points out that for the entirety of the 19th century, the House was actually the obstructionist chamber. And you can find quotes from senators that sound just like quotes from members of the House today, just decrying the fact that, oh, everything goes to die in the House, whereas we pass things really quickly in the Senate. It's really only at the beginning of the 20th century that obstruction sort of becomes more prominent in the Senate. When that happens, you get the first cloture motion in 1917. That the cloture threshold then gets lowered in the 70s. But in between there, basically, the filibuster, that is unlimited debate, is only used for things that people feel, that members of the Senate feel really strongly about for almost the entire 20th century. And that means it's basically only used for civil rights bills. Basically, the purpose of the filibuster for the 20th century is to kill off civil rights legislation. It starts getting used increasingly in the 70s.
Is that a hindsight? Like, I guess, is that a hindsight kind of like the only thing it was used for was to kill out civil rights legislation, like that, right? Like,
right.
That's
it
what
wasn't
I'm kind of
a norm at the time that you could only use it for that. But because filibustering for that period actually required holding the floor, it only got used for things people felt really strongly about. And it turns out that's what people felt really strongly about preventing from becoming law, right? That is to say that Southern Democrats were sufficiently strongly opposed to the filibuster, to civil rights legislation, that is what they were willing to hold the floor for weeks and months on end to try to kill. And they did kill. That's why anti-lynching legislation never passed. That's why you don't get civil rights bills throughout the entire 50s. And when you finally get them in the 60s, it's because you finally get a coalition that's willing to wait for just months and months on end. It's not really until the 90s that the filibuster becomes something that happens with every bill. So the 1990s is when we get the rise of what we call the 60-vote Senate. That is to say, this idea, now you see it in news reports, right? The newspapers will just say, or the news will just say, it takes 60 votes to pass something in the Senate, which is not quite true. It takes 60 votes to get a vote on something in the Senate, and then it passes by majority. But that idea that just, everything takes 60 votes, that's a creature of the last 30 years.
But that's to kind of my point, which was about, so what I was going to say was just kind of like in the idea of the filibuster and the Electoral College, which is like one of the things that I think has stymied reform on either of these fronts, is functionally the fact that they are about principle and not outcome, and have been used by both sides at various points. And you just kind of pointed out, the kind of how the filibuster had been used as by Democrats during the civil rights era, but there are all of these things that it's unclear whether this is always going to result in an outcome that is anti-democratic or against kind of the principles of good, or whether it just depends on which side you're looking from, whether or not that's true. And so that's kind of a little bit when I say the structural nature of changing something like this seems to have much more. You just have to be, I think that this is one of the reasons that these are slow to change. I think that, and maybe that's a good thing. And so I'm just curious what your thoughts are.
So it certainly doesn't have sort of consequences that are uniformly in one direction or another, right? So if there were no filibuster, the Affordable Care Act would have looked very different, right? It would have had a public option, among other things. On the other hand, if there were no filibuster, it would have been repealed in 2017, right? The reason the Republicans couldn't get it's true, the Republicans couldn't get 50 votes for their skinny repeal, but the reason is that they had to make all kinds of compromises to try to ram it through with reconciliation. If they could have drafted their fantasy bill from scratch, I think they could have gotten to 50. So it cuts both ways, right? It would have made for a more liberal ACA to begin with, and it would have made it easier to get rid of the ACA entirely. So you're absolutely right about that. That said, I think over sort of the long sweep of congressional history, I think one pattern we see is that in either house, when obstruction becomes really significant over a period of a couple decades, at some point, the dam breaks and the procedures change. So you saw this with the House of Representatives in the 1890s. You saw it with the Senate in the 19-teens. You saw it with the House again in the 1950s. You saw it with the Senate in the 1970s, right? It's just this continual, it's like a sine wave, right? It just
it's a beautiful point. It's so correct.
All right, yeah. Andrew McMahon, your video's frozen, so I turned it off. Your audio's maybe working fine. So what's your question?
Yeah, thanks. My video just doesn't work on this thing. So, Josh, my question for you: the recent Supreme Court case involving Congress and the tax returns. Give us your take on that one, and also the advocate Doug Letter. Do you have any opinion about his performance?
I have an opinion about Doug Letter, but Josh, you first.
So I may punt on the second half of that question because to be honest, I didn't listen to oral arguments live. I know the criticisms, but I also don't actually think that oral arguments actually make a difference in cases like this. And I think the briefing was fine. The decision is awful. The decision is sort of not just Congress disempowering in a really bad way. It's also just unbelievably self-servingly court empowering, especially when you pair it with Vance, right? So Vance is the decision that comes out the same day, also authored by Roberts, sort of saying, well, the president is no different than anyone else in dealing with grand jury subpoenas. And then in Mazars, the court says, well, when you're subpoenaing the president's information, it has to clear this much higher threshold than any other kind of congressional subpoena. And you look at what Roberts says about sort of the way grand juries work and the way courts work, and it's all very noble, and we presume they follow the law, we presume they do the right thing. And then you look at the way he describes how Congress works, and it's all, oh, we presume they're awful and they're just out to score political points, right? And so what Roberts is doing is just building up his own institution, tearing down a rival institution, and he's doing it all in a way that has the effect of guaranteeing that none of this information, in either case, is going to come out before the presidential election. So he manages to sort of simultaneously give his institution a win and his president a win, and Congress comes out sort of the loser in all of this.
All right, I will say a couple of words in defense of poor Doug Letter. Doug Letter, in addition to being a good friend, and somebody who is a very long-serving Justice Department civil appellate lawyer of the highest caliber, is one of the very talented oral advocates of our time, and has mostly at the appellate court, less at the Supreme Court level, because civil appellate doesn't represent the United States in the Supreme Court. It represents the SG's office does that. It largely does the work at the federal courts of appeals. There is no advocate in the country that I can think of offhand who has a deeper, better relationship with, for example, the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals than Doug Letter does. He's a superb advocate, and even superb advocates have bad days. And I agree with Josh that this case was decided on the briefs. Every justice walked in there knowing what they wanted to do with this case. And so, I think the temptation to say, like, Doug Letter blew this at oral argument actually sells the justices a little bit short. Every single justice walked into oral argument knowing exactly what they meant to do at conference. And 40 or 50 years from now, their papers will, you can come back to me and say their papers show that they were all meaning to go the other way. And Doug Letter, fucked it up at oral argument. And then I'll say, okay, you were right. Until then, give Doug a break.
I think the only time oral argument ever really matters is in really technical areas where the justices really don't understand what's going on, and so they read the briefs and then they genuinely have questions. It might matter in ERISA cases or.
Josh, you and I have clerked for the same court. Like, we've both been on the Second Circuit. You were with Guido. I was with Richard Wesley. They're friends. They love each other. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, and you will hear that from SCOTUS. Anyone who clerked, it does matter a little bit in maybe SCOTUS, but it doesn't matter in the appellate courts. They everyone.
Actually, there's some pretty good empirical evidence that it doesn't matter at SCOTUS either. I forget the name of
I didn't want to say. I know it's a little depressing. I didn't want to get there.
Let's just be really candid about this. I think she was a law student, and I forget her name. The Washington Post did a very nice story about it at the time the article came out. But she went to every oral argument for a term and predicted how every justice was going to vote in every case based on their questions or non-questions at oral argument. And she got it all right. The whole claim you can't predict cases based on oral argument is total bullshit.
I mean,
you
but
can 95% of the time.
But I don't want to be like, I don't want to like talk out of turn here. But Josh, like, I would prep my judge for something, and I will say this: there were a few cases that I prepped my judge for that looked like, by all accounts, if you had done an 80 a B- to B job of reading the briefs and everything else, like you would like just affirm, right? And if you had like decided to kind of like really dig into it, like you would find all of these very high level like errors that were like obvious that some people had not pointed out. And it was kind of one of these things where, I don't know, I just kind of feel like people don't, I don't want to like say this, but like people don't give like full like shrift to like the power of clerks to spell that story out for their judge. Like I feel as if like it's a story of management almost. Like it's kind of just like you trust people, you bring in smart people to advise you, and you trust that they're going to do a really smart job in researching things. And my judges aren't stupid, or like they read everything I wrote, like they read and they checked my facts, but like they're also kind of trusting me to do the due diligence. And like a lot of clerks don't do it, and a lot of clerks do, and like it just kind of matters like who you're picking. And like I don't know, that's just like this whole thing behind the judiciary that I feel like is like a bit of my legal realism take. But Josh might feel differently. I don't know. What do you think?
That's exactly
Josh?
right. I mean, I think that at the Court of Appeals level, the check on that is that you have ideally 3 different clerks all reading the same papers, and so hopefully at least one of them points out to their judge something that then gets passed around. And obviously at the Supreme Court level, hopefully you have 9 clerks sort of doing that. But yeah, I think like I think that the papers matter in a lot of these cases. I think in a lot, at the Supreme Court level, there are probably a lot of cases where the briefing doesn't matter either, right? You could just tell all 9 of the justices the question presented, and all 9 of them would tell you, if they were being
100%.
candid, would tell you exactly how they were going to rule in that case, right? And I think Mazur's is that case.
Yes. My gosh, completely.
But at the Court of Appeals level, it's probably fewer cases like that, right? Because they're often the Court of Appeals is doing error correction and things like that. And there's a lot of technical, cases where it might matter. But, a case like Mazur's, I just don't think advocacy matters in any way. I don't think it matters on the papers, and I certainly don't think it matters at all.
John Bordeaux, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Hello, how you doing?
Thank you for the logo, which got an overwhelming vote of approval.
Loved it.
I would say the cartoonist has been watching and is delighted at the poll results as well, and has totally got it on the first measure. We'll follow up. There's going to be a 3 or 4 color version for your merchandise, so talk. It's going to be great.
Wow.
And just a second, you guys are very generous.
The cartoonist get the name of the show in there, because we do need the words.
He's going to hand letter the name of the show. Is of capitalized or not?
I always abbreviate it IL capital I, capital L, lowercase o, capital F. But I
think that's
don't
right.
feel strongly about it.
Yeah, I don't really either. But yeah.
And the Monty Python, say no more. Got it. Okay. That's easy. I just for a few seconds, you always are very generous in talking about how lovely the audience is in Crowdcast. You guys earned it. The reason you have gifts of wine, gifts of the cartoon, you are giving a gift to us that we have appreciated throughout, and don't stop. So please, you've earned it. Josh, sir, first of all, I also want to point out that Josh has a world-class router in his background and a magnificent bar selection behind him, despite his water.
It is, and especially on In Lieu of Fun, we appreciate the cocktail capacity that represents. Though I do point out that the man's drinking water.
It's important that with that kind of capacity, one not break it out every day right at 5. that way,
You have not been watching this show. The question I have goes back to a relic that Beltway hands like me have really missed, and that's the Office of Technology Assessment. I mean, we can make jokes about how completely feckless Congress is on the question of Silicon Valley types and such, but with the acceleration of technology, 5G, quantum issues, playing a role in foreign policy, would the OTA solve a lot of these problems? Can we get back, or would it really, at this point, partisanship is moved beyond that? That's my question.
So that's a great question.
Great question.
And OTA was a very good entity. OTA was killed off during the Gingrich speakership. At the same time, we saw a significant diminution that has continued basically to this day in all of the congressional, sort of internal congressional agencies. So if you look at, for example, the Congressional Research Service or CBO or GAO, all of them have much smaller staffs than they did in the 80s and 90s. The average tenure of people who work there is much shorter. There were people, it used to be the case that there were people at CRS who spent their entire career there who were among the world's experts in all kinds of topics. So, on the public law side, for example, Lieu spent his entire career at the Congressional Research Service, and he knows more than anyone about a whole host of topics, ranging from congressional fiscal powers to congressional war powers. But the sort of generation after him, a lot of them left. So I think about someone just really brilliant like Matt Glassman, who spent, I think, 11 years at CRS and then decamped, is now at Georgetown, which I'm thrilled about. But that is a loss for CRS, and that's a loss for Congress. OTA was completely eliminated. Now, I will say I see some fairly hopeful signs in the last 2 years. The House Modernization Committee, and I should, as a disclaimer, I was part of an American Political Science Association task force that advised the Modernization Committee. So I'm not entirely disinterested here. But the Modernization Committee, I think, has done a lot of really good work, and a lot of their proposals have been adopted. And one of the things that I think they've considered, I don't know that it hasn't gone through yet, I don't know if it will, is basically bringing the OTA back by another name. And the truth is, a lot of the Republicans are actually very happy to bring back something like OTA, as long as it's not called OTA, right? So as long as you can't sell it as, well, they're going back on what Gingrich did, I think a lot of them would be very happy to have it back. And a lot of members of both houses were sort of have been embarrassed by things like the Facebook hearings and recognize the need for that kind of expertise. And so I wouldn't be surprised to see something like it come
Recognized
back.
in what sense by the Facebook hearings? I'm actually curious what you mean by that.
Feel like they looked bad on TV, sort of not knowing, not having a sense of what was going on.
Good. Yeah. They okay. Good. That was what I was hoping you were saying. But yeah. Okay. Good.
Big Blue Blogger, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you, Josh and Kate. Another great show. Daniel Burge and I had actually posed very similar questions. He had asked how the
but he's gotten raptured in more recently than you have, so it's your turn.
Okay.
Daniel,
Well,
it's Big Blue's turn today.
Fair enough. He had asked about the decline of committee chairs and how that's affected partisanship. I had asked about earmarks and whether they had sort of served as a lubricant that kept the sausage machine running. What are your thoughts on earmarks and the decline of the power of chairman?
So those are both great questions. So I think the loss of earmarks is just a bad thing all around. I think it's bad because it makes deal making harder, which is unfortunate. But I think it's also bad, even leaving that aside, because earmarks, the decline of earmarks, we have enough political science literature on this to know the decline of earmarks didn't in any way decrease government spending. What it does is shifts who decides on government spending from Congress to the executive branch, right? So the decline of earmarks both sort of makes it harder to get deals worked out in Congress and takes out of the hands of Congress decisions about how money is going to be spent. That in turn not only sort of means that those decisions are made by by less representative groups, but it also takes leverage away from Congress institutionally when dealing with the executive. right? One of the ways that Congress exercises leverage over the executive is through its decisions about how to spend things, and often very granular decisions about how to spend money. And to the extent that earmarks diminish that, you've got a lot less power in Congress's hands institutionally.
I'm really surprised to hear that, mostly because I think that, like, when I was an investigative reporter covering Alaska and the earmarks on a lot of spending out of Alaska, and granted, Ted Stevens was a senior member in the Senate and was at that, like, in the House Energy Committee, and had a ton of leverage and a ton of power and, like, tons of ability to, like, create earmarks. But the earmarks into Alaska were so suspect, and they felt like it just, I have to say, like, earmarks felt like corruption. I remember, like, learning about earmarks and learning about lobbying for the first time, like, slightly out of college, and just being like, this is allowed? We just, like, let this happen? And so I'm a little surprised, like, you think that, like, I'm also open to it. I could have my mind changed if someone wanted to, like, change my mind. But, like, if you wanted to change my mind about what that earmarks were for good, I just don't see them as that. Like, is that, am I wrong?
The question has to be who's making the spending decisions now, and sort of in to what end are they being made? And it's not clear. So, for example. If you think about where NASA has facilities, this isn't a story about earmarks. This is a story about presidential control, right? The three biggest NASA facilities were in the president's home state and the two most electorally important states at the time, right? So you get Texas, Florida, and California as the sort of homes of NASA because you have LBJ in the presidency. And you have California and Florida as both swing states at the time. So it's, these decisions are being made, spending decisions are not being made in a purely technocratic way, even if that's sort of theoretically possible under any circumstances. So again, to my mind, the question is, who do we want having a say in that? And I think at the end of the day, yes, it's going to be skewed in certain ways. Certain members are going to be more powerful than others. And this goes to the second half of the question about the importance of committee chairs. Certain members are going to be more powerful than others, and that's going to help them steer money to their districts. But at the same time, they have to spread it around, right? They have to make sure that the rest of their caucus, and indeed sort of beyond their caucus, is on board with it. And so at the end of the day, you don't just wind up with all of the money flowing to Alaska just because Ted Stevens is powerful, right? You wind up with perhaps a disproportionate amount of money flowing to Alaska, although it's disproportionate as against what baseline.
I would say it's disproportionate, like, against, like, the entire gap. I mean, they, like, provide a tremendous amount of value to the American economy. So whatever, but, like, it's not per capita. Sorry. So
well, certainly not per capita, but I don't think you'd want it to be per capita, right? In the sense that, here's an area where geography might really matter, right? Like, you just need more miles of roads in Alaska than you do in a smaller but more populous state. You need sort of presumably more hospitals per capita because you need people to be close to hospitals, not just a certain number of beds, right? There's also, per capita is not a great way to figure out how much money should be spent either. I think the broader point here is just someone is making these decisions. These decisions are inevitably both value laden and replete with electoral consequences. And given that somebody has to be making them, I would rather it be something that comes out of the congressional process, not because I think that's deliberative in some sort of deliberative democracy sense, but because I think the distributive politics that take place in Congress actually work out, sort of contain the kind of built-in checks that I'm more comfortable with than simply delegating it wholesale to the executive. And by getting rid of earmarks, you wind up delegating it wholesale to the executive.
All right, Zach Bliss, the last question goes to you. Except that you're inaudible.
I think he's muted.
Try that again.
It's true. I appear to be. Am I now audible?
You are audible.
I pulled an audible, but so words. If you look at like the last few years, the number of like bills that have just been passed, at least, and this is one thing that annoys me because like C-SPAN doesn't track anything except for roll call votes. But if you're anything except that, I forget which one it is, but if you look at the number of things that passed on that list, at least, it's a much smaller number. And then in recent years, like the number of things that have passed has gone way down. And it just upsets me a little bit that like Mitch McConnell can just kind of choose not to vote on things. And and correct me if that's not how it works, but it seems like they choose which topics to talk about. They choose what language to use. They choose when it gets to get voted on, and they vote on it. And I feel like I remember an argument or someone making an argument. I think it was Hamilton, might not have been. And I think he used this exact same example, but just like making the opposite point to me. But it seems like they are choosing like the cases to bring to court. They are making the arguments as the lawyers. They are voting on the jury. And like Mitch McConnell's the judge kind of. And it just seems weird. And so why is that not weird?
All right. Great question to end on. Like, when you look at the way the institution functions from a common sense, relatively, surface perspective, it looks dysfunctional and absurd. And you're arguing that it actually works a little bit better than we acknowledge. And yet the poll data on confidence in Congress is much closer to Zach's view than to yours.
Yep.
And so isn't there something wrong, like seriously wrong, if only 11% of the population believes that it's actually functioning well?
Yes, absolutely. That is not good. That is not good for democracy. That is not good for sort of self-government in any way. I think it goes back to something we talked about at the very beginning, right? Which is exactly what would not just what would a well-functioning legislature look like, but what would a legislature that people approved of look like? And it can't just be about passing certain policies, because we know a big part of the problem, of course, is us, right? We don't want to insist on that, but one of the reasons that Congress is deeply divided is because the American public is pretty deeply divided. And we don't have sort of widespread consensus on major policy changes that we want to see enacted to a large degree. And even sometimes when people think we have consensus, we don't have consensus, right? So, we might have widespread consensus that something should be done about topic X, but then when you start trying to put together an actual proposal to do something about topic X, it turns out we don't agree about what to do about it. So then there's two options, right? Either nothing happens, right? Status quo remains, or a deal gets cobbled together. But cobbling a deal together in a democracy requires throwing something to a lot of different interest groups. And then that looks like the kind of deal making that a lot of people find really unattractive. So this is the sort of Hibbing and Thiesmore's point, that it's almost impossible to cobble together in a representative system, it's almost impossible to cobble together a deal that both has sufficient support to pass and where people like what they see about the process. So part of the answer here, I think, is that people who follow this stuff need to stop dissing Congress as much as they do, right? It's not that we need to become cheerleaders for the institution. I'm certainly not. But we do need to sort of think about what the alternative is and whether sort of Congress is doing a good job in relationship to what we ought to expect it to do, rather than sort of, oh, well, if I ran everything, we'd have the following changes. And we ought to, I think, explain to people better that this is what it looks like when a powerful legislature actually has to engage with questions of policy. And it looks different than it looks in, say, a Westminster system, because Parliament has no power in Westminster, right? I mean, we talk about parliamentary sovereignty in a Westminster system, but actually Parliament exists to vote into office a government and then to rubber stamp what that government does. And so
Yes.
Parliamentary deliberations
Completely.
look sort of orderly and stately and all of that. When you have an actually powerful legislature, where deals are actually either getting hashed out or not, the hashing out process isn't going to look great to people. And part of what doesn't look great about it is things like earmarks. Part of what doesn't look great about it is things like, you know, the Affordable Care Act, right? The Cornhusker kickback and all of these other like sort of goodies that were given away to sort of individual members. But that's how you cobble deals together. And the reason that Congress looks unattractive on that view is in part because it's so open, right? Because Congress
because of the art of the deal.
Right. But Congress is the one institution where we really see those deals happening, right? You know, the justices won't even allow cameras in the courtroom, which is purely ceremonial, and they're certainly never going to allow them into conference or into the sort of their dealings with their
do you
clerks.
actually think that they should allow like, I disagree.
Oh, absolutely.
Oh,
Yeah.
really? Like, I'm actually like all about the tech and all about everything, and I think that like this is like, so anyways, this is
We may have
interesting.
different goals in mind. I want cameras in there because I want people to see what a ridiculous farce the Supreme Court is. But
yes, no, actually, if that is your goal, then I would support you. So like, that's fine. If you want to try to prop up the Supreme Court as an institution, I don't want cameras. Yeah, I think that's a terrible idea. But that's how I feel about Congress and earmarks. And so like, you know, like that's like exactly how I feel about Congress and earmarks, which is just like, you know, we could go to war on this all day long, but at some point we just sound like we're just kind of like Madison discovering. Like, did you ever? I had Gordon Wood for history when I was in college, and he told this story of like Madison going back to Virginia and seeing Congress, like, and all of the pork barrel trading, and like literally like these farmers and these illiterate like kind of farmers coming in and running for office, but because they had power, getting elected and all of these things, and he hated it and came back as an elitist and was basically like, let's make the Senate. And that being kind of like the moment that the Senate got created, that at least is Gordon Wood's formulation of the history of the United States. And I've always like thought about that. Like, it's just like it's a very hard trade-off.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly, you know, part of what's going on in 1787 is that they've had about 10 years of experience with really, really powerful legislatures at that point, right? I mean, what happens in the state constitutions that are created immediately after the Revolution is that the governors are almost entirely disempowered. In some cases, the governors are appointed by the legislature, and they have, you know, almost no power. And what's happened is a sort of legislatures that have done things like pass a lot of debtor relief, and obviously the elites don't particularly like that because the elites tend to be creditors, and so, or at least the kinds of debtors whose creditors never collected, like, you know, Jefferson. And so you then get a sort of more elitist, although, you know, Gordon Wood was instrumental in teaching us not as elitist as someone like Beard thought, but a more elitist federal system, precisely because they were reacting against what they saw in the state systems.
All right, we need to wrap. Josh, not Jason. Thank you so much for joining us.
I appreciate you getting that right consistently throughout.
You know, I didn't even screw up once.
Yeah, we
one
didn't.
syllable in the first name, one F
it was
in
very
the last
easy.
name. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to Washington.
Thank you for having me.
And we will, you know, scrape the enthusiasm about Congress off you with time in the Capitol. Kate, who do we have tomorrow?
Oh God, who do we have? Shoot,
we
have Elliot.
We have Elliot Morris, who is also been the subject of repeated requests from the audience, who is coming on to talk about the Economist's election model. And yes, when 538 releases their election model, which by the way is happening tomorrow, at least according to Nate Silver, we will bring somebody on from 538 to, you know, mix it up with, and we can have the models like in the red corner and in the blue corner. The models will fight it out. We'll see how far off they really are from each other. Until then, 22 hours and 55 minutes from now, we don't have fun anymore. But in lieu of fun, we have Congress.
I was gonna say the
Sounds
filibuster, but that's fine. I'm gonna keep talking until you just like cut me off. Like I'm just gonna keep going.
Really?